Jacob Mercer was 15 years old, riding in a boxcar through the mountain pass when the blizzard hit. The train stopped for 3 hours while the storm raged outside, and Jacob watched through a crack in the wooden slats as the world turned white and deadly. But inside the boxcar, he was dry. The curved metal roof shed the snow like water off a duck's back. The walls blocked the wind completely. The space wasn't warm exactly, but it wasn't killing cold either. A shell, Jacob said to himself. The train car is like a shell around us. His dog, a shepherd named Duke, lifted his head at the sound of his voice. Duke had been with Jacob for 2 years now, ever since they'd both been abandoned. Jacob by a father who drank too much, Duke by owners who moved away and left him tied to a fence post. They'd found each other. They'd survived together. And now Jacob was thinking, what if I built a shell around a cabin? He wondered aloud. Something big enough to cover the whole thing. Keep the snow off. Block the wind, like armor for a house. Duke's tail thumped against the boxcar floor. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. His human was planning something. Planning meant building. Building meant purpose. 3 months later, they arrived in Cold Creek, Montana. Jacob had $17, a bag of tools, and an idea that everyone said was the stupidest thing they'd ever heard. They were wrong. Montana Territory, August 1891. The town of Cold Creek had seen plenty of young drifters come through. Boys running from something or toward something, looking for land or gold or a fresh start. Most of them lasted 1 winter and fled back east with frostbitten fingers and broken dreams. Jacob Mercer didn't look any different from the rest. 16 years old now, thin but wiry, with calloused hands and watchful eyes. The dog at his side was the only thing that made people look twice. "That's a fine animal," said Henry. Wallace, who ran the general store and served as the town's unofficial welcome committee. "Shepherd, isn't he?" "Yes, sir. His name's Duke." "And what brings you to Cold Creek, son?" "Looking to homestead. I heard there's land available up on the North Ridge." Henry's eyebrows rose. "The North Ridge? That land's available because nobody wants it. Too exposed. The wind up there will freeze you solid before Christmas." "I know about the wind." Jacob's voice was calm, certain. "I have a plan for it." "A plan?" Henry chuckled. "Son, men twice your age, with 10 times your money, have tried to build on that ridge. The snow buries everything. The wind tears apart anything the snow doesn't bury. What kind of plan could a 16-year-old boy possibly have?" "I'm going to build a shell." "A what?" "A steel arch over my cabin, like a roof over a roof. The arch takes the snow and the wind. The cabin underneath stays protected." Henry stared at him for a long moment. Then he laughed, not meanly, but with genuine disbelief. "Son, that's either the smartest thing I've ever heard or the craziest." He shook his head. "Probably both." "Probably," Jacob agreed. "But I'm going to do it anyway." The land cost him 12 of his $17. Nobody else wanted the North Ridge parcel. 40 acres of exposed hillside that caught every storm that rolled through the valley. The previous 3 owners had all abandoned it, leaving behind the foundations of cabins that had collapsed under snow load or been torn apart by wind. Jacob walked the property on his first day, Duke padding beside him, and studied the failures of those who'd come before. "They built too light," he said, examining a collapsed roof beam, "and too exposed. No windbreak, no protection. Just cabins sitting in the open like targets." Duke sniffed at the rotted wood, then looked up at his human expectantly. We're gonna do it different, boy. We're going to build a cabin that can't be touched. The first step was the arch. Jacob had seen the curved steel structures in railroad yards, storage buildings made of corrugated metal panels bolted together into a half-cylinder shape. They were ugly but incredibly strong, designed to shed snow and resist wind loads that would flatten a conventional building. He couldn't afford to buy one, but he could build one. The steel came from a failed mining operation 20 miles north. The mine had closed 2 years ago, leaving behind equipment, buildings, and piles of corrugated steel panels that nobody wanted. Jacob offered the caretaker $3 for as much steel as he could haul. The man laughed and told him to take whatever he could carry. It took Jacob 6 weeks to transport it all. He made the trip 17 times, loading his small wagon with steel panels, dragging it behind a mule he'd borrowed in exchange for labor, hauling the materials up the ridge one agonizing load at a time. The panels were heavy and awkward, cutting his hands through his work gloves, threatening to slide off the wagon on every steep section of trail. The work nearly broke him. On the 4th trip, a panel sliced through his glove and opened his palm to the bone. He stitched it himself with thread and a needle he'd heated in flame, biting down on a stick while Duke whimpered beside him. On the 9th trip, the wagon wheel cracked, and he had to carry panels on his back, 3 at a time, 200 pounds of steel across 3 miles of mountain trail. His shoulders bled where the metal edges dug in. On the 15th trip, a thunderstorm caught him in the open. He huddled under the wagon with Duke, watching lightning split trees 100 yards away, and wondered if he'd survive to finish what he'd started. But he kept going. Every morning he woke up sore and exhausted, and every morning he loaded the wagon again. "One more trip," he would tell Duke. "Just one more. Then we rest." But one more always became another, because the arch in his mind wouldn't build itself, and nobody else was going to do it for him. Duke walked beside him on every trip, sometimes running ahead to scout the path, sometimes falling behind to investigate interesting smells, but always returning, always present. "Good boy," Jacob would say during rest breaks, sharing his water with the dog. "We're getting there, slow but steady." By the end of September, he had enough steel to build an arch 40 feet wide and 60 feet long. Now he just had to figure out how to put it together. The townspeople came to watch, of course. Word had spread about the crazy boy on the North Ridge, the one building something that nobody could quite identify. They rode up in 1s and 2s, curious, skeptical, ready to witness a failure. "What in God's name is that supposed to be?" asked Thomas Reed, the town's most successful rancher. He sat on his horse at the edge of Jacob's property, staring at the partially assembled arch frame. "Looks like a whale skeleton." "It's a shelter," Jacob replied, not stopping his work. He was on a ladder, bolting curved steel ribs to the foundation anchors he'd sunk in concrete. "When it's done, I'll build my cabin inside it." "Inside it?" Thomas laughed. "Boy, you're building a barn and then putting a house in the barn?" "Something like that." "That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. You're doing twice the work for the same result." "Not the same result." Jacob climbed down from the ladder to face the rancher. "When the blizzards come, your cabin roof has to hold all that snow. Your walls have to block all that wind, and if they fail, you freeze." He gestured at the arch taking shape behind him. "My cabin won't have to do any of that. The arch handles the snow. The arch handles the wind. The cabin just has to be a cabin." Thomas shook his head. And when your arch collapses, when all that steel comes crashing down on your little cabin, the arch won't collapse. This design holds up locomotive sheds. It's held up worse than Montana winters. We'll see about that. Thomas turned his horse to leave. Don't come crying to me when you're buried under your own foolishness, boy. He rode away without looking back. Jacob returned to his work. October brought the frame's completion and the cabin's beginning. The arch stood complete now, a massive half-cylinder of corrugated steel, open at the front, closed at the back, anchored to concrete footings that went 4 feet into the ground. It looked strange against the Montana landscape, an industrial intrusion into the wilderness. But it was solid. When Jacob stood inside and looked up at the curved ceiling 40 feet above, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Safe. Now comes the easy part, he told Duke, who had claimed a spot near the arch entrance as his supervisory position. Building a cabin is simple. I've done it before. He hadn't, actually, but he'd watched others do it, and he had books, and he had time. The arch gave him time. He could work through rain, through early snow, through weather that would have stopped any outdoor construction. The shell protected him while he built. The cabin took shape through October and November, log walls rising inside the steel cocoon, a peaked roof that didn't need to hold snow because the arch held it instead, windows and a door and a chimney that vented through a gap he'd left in the arch's peak. He built it bigger than he needed, because he had the space, 2 rooms instead of 1, a loft for storage, a proper porch, even though the porch was inside the arch and would never feel rain or snow. Then came the firewood. Jacob understood that the arch wasn't just shelter. It was storage. All that protected space along the walls, the gaps between the cabin and the curved steel shell could hold enough firewood to last years instead of months. He began cutting in late November, felling trees from his property, splitting logs until his arms burned and his back screamed. Duke would drag smaller branches back to the arch, while Jacob hauled the heavy sections on a makeshift sled. By December, he had stacked firewood from floor to ceiling on both sides of the cabin, massive walls of split logs that turned the gaps into solid barriers. Anyone looking at the arch from outside would see wood, and more wood, with just the cabin door visible between the 2 mountains of fuel. That's enough wood to last 3 winters, Henry Wallace observed during one visit, his jaw dropping at the sight. That's the idea. Jacob wiped sweat from his face despite the cold. Never want to be caught without. Most folks just cut what they need for the season. Most folks haven't seen what a real winter can do. Jacob's voice was quiet but firm. I have. I won't be caught. Won't. Unprepared. Not ever. The townspeople kept coming to watch. Their skepticism slowly shifted to something else. Not quite belief, but curiosity. Interest. I still think you're crazy, Henry Wallace said on one visit, watching Jacob install his windows. But I'm starting to think you might be crazy like a fox. Is that a compliment? I'm not sure yet. Ask me in spring. December brought the first real test. The storm rolled in on December 14th, a howling monster that the old-timers said was the worst they'd seen in 20 years. Wind speeds that could knock a man down. Snow falling so thick you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. Temperatures dropping to 30 below zero. Jacob was inside his cabin when it hit. He heard the wind slam into the arch, a deep, resonant boom that vibrated through the steel. He heard snow piling on the curved roof above, heard it sliding off the sides the way it was designed to. He heard the sounds of a blizzard that was trying its best to kill everything in its path. And inside his cabin, inside his arch, he was warm. The stove burned steadily, heating the small space to a comfortable temperature. The cabin walls held firm, unbuffeted by wind because the arch blocked it completely. Snow wasn't piling on his roof, wasn't threatening to collapse it, wasn't slowly burying him alive. Duke lay by the stove, completely unconcerned, his tail occasionally thumping when Jacob looked his way. "We did it, boy," Jacob said softly. "We actually did it." The storm lasted 3 days. Jacob spent them reading, cooking, tending the fire, and adding to his firewood stack from the massive supply he'd built up along the inside walls of the arch. He had enough wood stored in that protected space to last 3 winters, all of it dry, all of it accessible without stepping outside into the killing cold. On the morning of December 17th, the storm broke. Jacob opened his cabin door, then walked through the protected space of the arch to its entrance. What he saw stopped him cold. The world was buried. Snow had drifted 15 feet high in places, covering buildings, blocking roads, transforming the landscape into an alien white desert. The trees that hadn't been protected were bent or broken. The sky was clear blue, but the temperature was still 20 below. And in the distance, smoke was rising from the valley. Not chimney smoke, building fire smoke. Something had gone very wrong in Cold Creek. He found out what when Thomas Reed appeared at his arch 2 hours later. The rancher looked nothing like the proud man who'd mocked Jacob's project 3 months ago. His face was raw with frostbite. His horse was stumbling with exhaustion. His eyes held the hollow look of someone who had seen something terrible. "The town," Thomas gasped, sliding off his horse. "The town is destroyed." "What happened?" "The general store collapsed. The weight of the snow. The roof just gave way. And there was a fire in the stove, and the whole building went up." Thomas was shaking, though whether from cold or shock, Jacob couldn't tell. The fire spread to the boarding house before the snow put it out. Half the town is homeless. The other half is trying to shelter them. But there's no room. There's no food. There's no... He stopped, staring past Jacob at the arch. At the cabin inside it. At the massive stacks of firewood along the walls. At the shelter that had survived the storm without a scratch. "My God," Thomas whispered. "It worked. It actually worked. How many people need shelter?" 14. Maybe more. Women and children from the families that lost their homes. Jacob didn't hesitate. "Bring them here." "Here?" Thomas looked around the arch's interior. "There's not enough room." "There's more room than they have now. The arch stays warm just from being enclosed. It's 30 degrees in here even without a fire. We can set up bedding, share food, share heat. It won't be comfortable, but it'll be alive." Thomas stared at him. This boy he'd dismissed as a fool. This 16-year-old with his crazy ideas and his dog and his determination. "Why?" Thomas asked. "Why would you help us?" "We laughed at you. I laughed at you. Because you need help." Jacob shrugged. "Everything else is just noise." By nightfall, 18 people were living in Jacob's arch. Not in the cabin. That stayed Jacob's, his private space, his reward for the months of work. But the arch itself became a communal shelter, filled with bedrolls and blankets and makeshift beds. Jacob set up a second stove in the open space, fed by the seemingly endless supply of firewood stacked along the walls. He organized cooking, rationed food, created a system that kept everyone warm and fed while the town tried to rebuild. The refugees included Martha Henderson and her 3 children, whose boarding house had burned. She was 42 years old and had lost everything except the nightgown she'd escaped in. The Patterson family, William, his wife Sarah, and their 2 teenage sons, whose cabin roof had collapsed while they slept. William had a broken arm from the beam that had fallen on him. Old Benjamin Cross, 73 years old, who had been staying at the boarding house because his own cabin had become too hard to maintain. He sat by the stove and told stories to the children to keep them calm. The Miller sisters, Ruth and Rebecca, 19 and 17, who had been working at the general store when it collapsed. Ruth had a gash on her forehead that Jacob stitched closed with thread and a sewing needle, the way he'd once stitched a wound on Duke. And others, faces and names and stories, all of them sharing the space that Jacob had built for himself, all of them alive because a boy had watched a train car shed snow and thought, what if? The crisis lasted 2 weeks. 14 days of shared meals and shared warmth and shared hope. 14 days of Jacob organizing work parties to dig out the town, salvage what could be saved, begin rebuilding what couldn't. 14 days of Duke circulating among the refugees, offering comfort with his presence, letting children bury their faces in his fur when they cried for their lost homes. That dog is worth his weight in gold, Martha Henderson said one evening, watching Duke let her youngest use him as a pillow. He knows exactly who needs him most. He's always been like that, Jacob replied. Found me when I needed finding. Guess he does the same for everyone. And what about you? Martha turned to look at him. Who found you? Nobody. Jacob's voice was matter-of-fact, not self-pitying. I found myself, built myself, same way I built this place. You built something extraordinary, you know. This shelter. I've never seen anything like it. It's just engineering. A shell over a cabin. Nothing special. It's special because you thought of it. Martha smiled. And because you shared it when you didn't have to. That's not engineering. That's character. Jacob didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded and went to check on the fire. By January, the town was recovering. The general store had been rebuilt, smaller, simpler, but functional. The families who had lost their homes were constructing new ones, working together in a way the town hadn't seen before. The crisis had changed something in Cold Creek, broken down the walls between neighbors, created bonds that wouldn't break easily. Martha Henderson organized a quilting circle that became the heart of the town's social life. The Patterson boys, once shy and withdrawn, became leaders among the younger generation. Old Benjamin Cross, who had expected to die alone in some charity home, found himself adopted by 3 families who fought over who would host him each week. The storm took things from us, Martha said at the spring gathering. But it gave us something too. It gave us each other. She looked across the crowd to where Jacob stood with Ruth, Duke sitting between them. And it gave us him, the boy who built a shell and then filled it with people who needed saving. Jacob felt his face flush. He still wasn't used to gratitude, to being seen as anything other than the crazy boy with the strange ideas. Ruth squeezed his hand. Get used to it, she whispered. You're a hero now whether you like it or not. I just built a building. You built a sanctuary. There's a difference. And 3 families had asked Jacob to teach them how to build arch shelters. The design isn't complicated, Jacob told Thomas Reed, who was now one of his most enthusiastic students. Curved panels, strong anchors, good drainage. The hard part is believing it'll work. I didn't believe it, Thomas admitted. I thought you were a fool. I know. I was wrong. Thomas extended his hand. I'm sorry. Jacob shook it. Apology accepted. Now let's talk about where you want to put your arch. Spring came, and with it, transformation. By May, 4 new arch shelters stood in the Cold Creek Valley. By the following winter, 11. The design spread beyond the town, carried by travelers who had seen Jacob's creation and couldn't stop talking about the boy who'd built armor for his cabin. Jacob trained apprentices, teaching anyone who wanted to learn. He charged only for materials, never for knowledge. You could be rich, Henry Wallace told him. Patent the design, charge licensing fees, build a business. I could, Jacob agreed. But then some family who couldn't afford the fee would try to survive without it, and maybe they wouldn't survive. His jaw set. Money's not worth that. Your father would have taken the money. My father isn't here, and I'm not him. Jacob wrote everything down. Detailed plans, material lists, construction sequences, common mistakes to avoid. He bound the pages into a small book and gave copies to anyone who asked. The books spread from hand to hand, copied and recopied, carried to mining camps and ranches and homesteads throughout the territory. Letters arrived from strangers thanking him for designs that had saved their families. A newspaper in Helena published an article calling him the Shell Builder. A mining company offered him a job designing shelters for their workers at twice what most men earned in a year. He turned them all down. I have everything I need, he told Ruth one evening, sitting on the porch inside their arch, watching snow fall harmlessly on the steel shell above. A home, a purpose, and someone to share it with. What else is there? Children, Ruth said, her hand moving to her stomach. Eventually, Jacob's eyes widened. Are you? Spring. She smiled. You're going to be a father. He pulled her close, unable to speak, and Duke pressed against both of them, tail wagging, somehow understanding that something wonderful had just happened. Henry studied the young man, because that's what Jacob was now, not a boy anymore. 18 years old, respected throughout the territory, engaged to Ruth Miller, who had never forgotten the boy who'd stitched her wound with steady hands while the world fell apart outside. No, Henry said finally. You're definitely not him. Thank God for that. Duke died in the autumn of 1897, old and gray and content. Jacob found him in his usual spot by the stove, peaceful, as if he'd simply decided that his work was done. The cabin felt emptier than it ever had before, the silence where Duke's breathing should be louder than any storm. He buried him at the entrance to the arch, where Duke had spent so many hours keeping watch over the construction, over the refugees, over the life they'd built together. The whole town came to the burial, not because Duke was just a dog, though he was a remarkable one, but because everyone understood what he'd represented: loyalty, persistence, the quiet belief that someone you love is doing something important. He found me when I needed finding, Jacob said, standing at the grave. He stayed when everyone else left. He believed in this place before anyone else did, including me some days. Ruth stood beside him, her hand in his. He was the best dog I've ever known. He was the best friend. Jacob laid a hand on the grave marker. Rest now, boy. You earned it. The marker read, Duke he kept watch 1885-1897. Jacob Mercer lived in his arch shelter until 1953, dying at the age of 78. By then, the design had spread across the northern territories, Montana, Wyoming, the Dakotas, parts of Canada. Thousands of families had built variations of the original concept, protecting their homes with shells of steel that turned deadly winters into minor inconveniences. They called them Mercer arches, despite Jacob's protests that he'd just copied what the railroad yards had been doing for decades. The name stuck anyway, attached to a design that had saved countless lives. He and Ruth raised 4 children in the cabin under the arch, each of whom learned to work steel before they could read. Their grandchildren spread across the West, carrying the knowledge with them, building shelters that protected families they would never meet. Jacob's funeral procession passed through the arch he'd built 62 years earlier. The steel was weathered now, patches of rust showing where the galvanization had worn through, but still solid, still strong, still doing the job it had been built to do. His grandson read the eulogy. "My grandfather came to Cold Creek with $17 and a dog," young Thomas said, named for the rancher who had become Jacob's first real friend in the town. Everyone thought he was crazy. Everyone said his idea would fail. He built it anyway, and when the worst storm in 20 years tried to kill this town, his shelter was the only thing standing. He looked at the crowd filling the arch, spilling out into the snow beyond. But he didn't just build a shelter. He built a community. When people needed help, he gave it without asking anything in return. When they wanted to learn, he taught without charging. When they were cold and scared and hopeless, he opened his door and said, "Come in, there's room." Young Thomas placed his hand on the casket. The arches he designed will outlast all of us, but the example he set, the kindness, the generosity, the belief that we're all in this together, that's the legacy that really matters. He stepped back. "Rest now, grandfather. Duke is waiting, and the shelters will stand." The original arch still stands. The cabin inside has been rebuilt twice, updated with modern conveniences, but the steel shell is original. The same panels Jacob hauled from that abandoned mine in 1891, still curved, still strong, still protecting whatever is built beneath. Visitors come to see it sometimes, to stand inside the space where 18 refugees survived the blizzard of 1891, to touch the walls that a 16-year-old boy built because he watched a train car shed snow and thought, "I can do that." At the entrance stands a memorial with 3 markers: Jacob Mercer, 1875-1953. He built the shell so others could build the home. Ruth Miller Mercer, 1874-1961. She saw what he could become. Duke, 1885-1897. He kept watch. Every winter, when the storms come and the snow piles high and the wind tries to tear the world apart, the arch sheds its load and stands firm. Inside, the cabin stays warm. Inside, the people stay safe. A shell over a home. A simple idea that changed everything. That was Jacob's gift to the world, and the world has never forgotten.